First of all, thank you all so much for coming today. Uh, and I'd like to say a special thank you to the South Asia Center for inviting me and for arranging this event. And I'd also like to thank Manan Desai, who really made this whole thing happen. It's great to connect with you, and I really appreciate the invitation. It's very cool to be back here for the first time in 9 years. I graduated in 2001, and I didn't really like Ann Arbor all that much when I was here, I have to say. But I think it was just, I was a young, disgruntled college student, very misanthropic and antisocial. With my only friend from that period of my life is sitting right here, right now. But in the 9 years since leaving Michigan, it really has come clear how important intellectually and academically my time at the university was. In some very simple ways and in some also more profound ways, in a very light way. Every time I enter a new library anywhere in the world, be it in India or be it in Europe or be it in New York City, I can't help but compare it to the libraries at Michigan, or anytime I'm at a new academic institution, I can't help but feel shortchanged by the computer labs or the soap dispensers, and in particular the books. And what I mean to say is that this university provides some tremendous resources to scholars, and it's really an amazing thing. Intellectually, my time in the program in comparative literature was also very formative. I work as a critic, and I sometimes even earn a living as a critic, and that's not an easy thing to do, to make money writing about books. But I do think the way I was trained to analyze text here in the Complet program with a certain amount of vitality and creativity did kind of mark me as unique in this market of freelance writers who were really craving gigs. So I'm very grateful to the university about that, for that. Along the lines of Comp Lit, in the courses I would take in the Department of Comparative Literature in the South Asia Studies program, I was really, we would ask a lot of questions about, where we're from, and we would talk about Indianness, often in a very academic way that I found frustrating, often in a very tangible way. The point is my time in these classes kind of lit a fire inside of me, a fire that was kind of, it inspired me to kind of really question where I was coming from culturally, sociologically, and the questions the seeds that were planted in my mind in these classes kind of led me to India, a place where I wasn't born, where my parents were born. And I moved to India about 5 years ago, and I lived there for about 4 years. And that brings us to Delhi Noir. And what I did in India was edit this book and put together this book and contribute to this book. So Delhi Noir. Noir as a genre, I asked Manan, I said, Manan, whatever you do, don't ask me what noir is today, and I'll be okay. But, what is noir? Noir is crime fiction, very basically, but it's very sophisticated crime fiction that offers some pretty iconoclastic perspectives on society. It's, defined by social realism. So the genre of noir has been very attractive to me as a writer because it's simultaneously very popular. You could reach a rather large audience with it, and at the same time you could communicate some pretty edgy perspectives to this audience, or some pretty some alternative perspectives on places like on cities. And the city is also a very important element in noir. As we had a roundtable discussion earlier today, and we discussed how urban spaces become characters themselves in noir writing. This particular book, I kind of had two goals as an editor of this book. One goal was to create a book for an Indian audience that was reflective of a lot of new, exciting literary and sociological trends that were going on in India and in Delhi right now in the context of English language writing. And my other goal was to kind of expand the canon of Indian English language writing that we have access to and that we read here in the United States. So for those of you who are scholars, I think you could understand that was a little bit of a balancing act, and you can't really. And I found that you can't really please everybody. And I learned one important thing in the whole process, that is that literature is certainly not a universal thing. That's kind of one myth that is kind of drilled into our heads. But a good story for an Indian audience is not necessarily a good story for an audience in Japan or for an audience in Ann Arbor, Michigan. I think that there are some writers in this volume that represent a kind of new trend in Indian English language writing. And these are writers who came of age when neoliberal economics were just there. Writers like Pankaj Mishra, Raj Kamal Jha, Siddharth Deb, these were people who, by the time they were in their teens and had gone through puberty, India was still in the 80s, and it was still certainly economically a somewhat closed place, and Nehruvian economics still played a major role in all that was going on. And some of the writers here, one of them in particular, a writer I encourage everyone to read if you are interested in Indian English language fiction, a guy named Siddharth Chaudhary. He was someone who was born around the same year as me, maybe early 1978. And by the time he was 20 years old, things like Coca-Cola or in just in a different type of relationship with commodity and money could be taken for granted. And I think that impacts the type of writing these writers do. Someone like Siddharth Chaudhary, again, one of the contributors to the book, he writes very unconcerned about what his foreign readers might think about him and his work. He doesn't care. And I think in not caring, writers like him are going to produce a type of literature that will be, that will be more reminiscent of Kafka or Bolaño than Rushdie. These aren't writers that are too interested in writing about the nation state. And I think the onus of representing the Indian nation to the outside world had stifled Indian English language writing. And hopefully during the decade ahead, in the next 2 decades ahead, we will see a more diverse array of narratives coming out of India that are smaller stories, that are stories that are noir stories, that are stories that take place, to quote the title of a novel by Siddharth Deb, in the outline of the Republic rather than in the center of the Republic. So, yeah, I think that's what I have to say before I start reading. I'm going to read a little excerpt from the introduction of this book, just to kind of orient you as to what this thing is all about. I should also say that this is a part of a series of noir books, which we could talk about after during the Q&A session, that started off with a book called Brooklyn Noir. And these books are published by the best little publishing house in the world, Akashic Books in New York City. And the aim of the Akashic Noir series is to kind of provide, is to really scrutinize the type of changes that are taking place in urban spaces throughout the world. I would venture to say that similar changes and transitions are occurring in metropolitan spaces in every country. Gentrification, there's a certain homogenization that's occurring, and a little house like this kind of wants to take a pretty close look at these urban changes and bring the city back to the forefront of literature and of our minds. Let me read. It's a piece called Everyday Anguish. I didn't title it, my editor did. Delhi, a city that's been reborn in various locations and forms throughout its thousands of years of history, was in the midst of yet another colossal transition when I arrived here 4 years ago. This latest metamorphosis was being fueled by legislation that opened up India to private and foreign investors. International brands like the Wall Street Journal and Chanel were setting up shop. The city's cruddy public transportation system was being revolutionized by an ultramodern metro. My mother's massive Punjabi family, partition refugees who had happily lived in a one-bedroom Connaught Place flat during the 1950s, were driving Hondas and Hyundais and comparing plasma television prices. For the first time in decades, members of the educated elite were experiencing a gleeful surge of nationalism, and they wanted to savor it. They bragged about the new malls and cinemas going up in Gurgaon, a quasi-American suburb in which civic planning plays second fiddle to corporate whims. They reveled in the number of billionaires who called their city home, as well as the rising values of the houses their parents had built. But things weren't and aren't as good as everyone wanted to believe. Every morning, papers abound with alarming stories, accounts of the unmitigated corruption and contract killing that make this city of more than 15 million tick, indications of increasing divisions between rich and poor that lead servants to murder masters and foment Maoist movements in the country's hinterland, synopses of so many rapes and sexual assaults that readers become numb to them. Yet the everyday depravity and anguish of Delhi life remains confined to news copy. Despite a few notable exceptions, authors of fiction, and specifically those who write in English, usually choose to ignore the capital stains. What explains the lack of noir, of crime and detective fiction set in Delhi? The next two paragraphs, I kind of offer a hypothesis that answers this question. And when I wrote this, I was very angry, and I'm not sure. First of all, a lot has changed. I wrote this probably maybe 2 years ago now, and I think a lot has changed since in the past 2 years. And I'm not as angry. So let me read it. Maybe it has something to do with the ghost of the great Indian novel in quotes. For many years, when it came to Indian fiction, big publishers, whether based in Delhi, London, or New York, had an insatiable appetite for epic, sometimes exotic novels. As a result, forays into other types of storytelling remained unpopular. Snobbery towards crime fiction, which some prematurely dismissed as esoteric or trivial, might also explain this dearth of noir in the Indian capital. I should also know that, there's not only a dearth of noir in the Indian capital, but there's a dearth of Delhi writing in general that people like to talk about, and that is changing. There's more narratives being written about in Delhi right now. But crime fiction is a vast, profound genre, and should not be so easily overlooked. Noir, in particular, is a medium that is pleasurable and seductive, atmospheric and seedy, and yet also forces readers to reckon with the inequity and cruelty inherent to modern societies. It's only natural that Delhi's book-buying and publishing citizens would avoid such writing. Any insight into their hometown's ugly entrails would threaten their guilt-free gilded existence and the bubble of nationalistic euphoria in which their lives are contained. They are too dependent on the power structures and social systems intrinsic to the city, embassies, government offices, and corporations, rural poverty, and illegal immigration, to risk looking critically at these things. I have to say that I wrote that when I was in India, and for an Indian audience, and reading that passage in the States feels a little bit like, airing dirty laundry here, which isn't necessarily such a worthwhile exercise. So I should add as an addendum, I think in the States, we are also addicted to a certain type of Indian narrative for very similar reasons. I think there is a narrative of, we could talk about this later, but let's say in Slumdog Millionaire of India as a capitalistic success story that we here in this country are equally invested in. Especially, Paul Krugman writes about this very, very wisely, as he tends to write, that after the dot-com boom, one thing that I think kept people who worked in money optimistic was the idea that the Indian economy, post-liberalization, was still doing so well. So again, this is a myth we're invested in as a people, and that's not a bad or a good thing, but it's a thing, and I think it does affect the type of narratives that we consume and the type of narratives that are produced. So that's the introduction. Any questions or anything before? Yes.
This book that you've edited, could you just be a little bit clearer? Are there any female authors in the book, and what year was it published?
Sure. First, before let me give you a couple. I'll give a few background details along with those. There are 14 stories in this book. They were all originally commissioned by me and written for this book. So the original works of fiction, each set in a different Delhi neighborhood, and that's something that goes along with the whole series of books. These are the precepts of the series, and additionally, there's one Hindi language writer in the book. We can again talk about that during the Q&A as to why that's the case. And there are 3 women writers in this book, 2 of whom live in Delhi and 1 of whom lives in New York City. Meera Nair, Manjula Padmanabhan, and Radhika Jha, all excellent prose practitioners. And when did it come out? It came out. The book was published in August 2009, and in Delhi in November 2009.
And do all the stories have a history or crime theme to it?
Indeed, yeah. I mean, every story is borrows to different extents from kind of some of the tropes of the genre of crime fiction, and some of them are just very stark. Some of them are there's one detective story, but yeah, I mean we're. It was another interesting thing in writing the book. There is a mystery audience that reads this book, and they definitely had to be kept in mind during the preparation of the book. So there was a conscious effort. This is one of the most literary volumes in the whole series, but still everything's grounded in crime fiction. Yeah.
Yeah, I'm wondering to what extent was your intended audience international, and to what extent Indian, and has it turned out as you expected in terms of where people are reading the book?
So when I was putting together this book, I was in India, I was very kind of steeped in the world of Indian literature, in the business of Indian literature. I enjoy the business of literature a great deal, actually. So my intended audience while creating the book, I definitely had the Indian audience in mind. And again, as I mentioned earlier, there was also this desire to kind of expand the canon of English language literature that is read and known in the United States or in the UK, for that matter. Although the Brits, you could say a lot about the Brits, but they do read a more diverse selection of Indian authors than Americans do. It's much easier for an Indian writer to get published in the UK than in the United States. So yeah.
Does it make any difference to the contributors whether they see themselves as writing for Indians within India or for a more international audience?
I think it depends on contributor to contributor, but one thing I'm noticing is that people care less and less about whether they're being received, how they're being received outside of India. And I think that has a lot to do, again, with various socioeconomic factors. The business of books has reached a whole new level of growth and size in India and in Delhi, where it's now headquartered. So it's not as if people can live off writing, but yeah, there's a culture. We get an advance. There's so many newspapers and magazines that are writing reviews, and people care less and less, I think. Of course, I think people care about international success more than anything else than for money.
And I guess the last part of my question was, in fact, is it being read more abroad or within India?
I think right now about equally. Just in numbers. I feel like the sales, it's about equal, but I think it will be read more in India eventually. This book has quite a small niche in the United States. We've sold, I'm not sure if I'm supposed to reveal this type of information, but since August, we've sold about 3,300 copies in the States, which for any of you who are in the business of books, that's a decent number.
For a short story collection.
For a short story collection, yeah, it's astronomical. Yes.
For someone who, let's say, wants to go to India or to live there or just to visit, whatever, if a person who's not from India reads this book, will they see, besides the themes of each of the short stories, will they get a better taste of, let's say, Delhi before they actually show up in Delhi?
My brief answer will be yes, and maybe that'll be a great segue into the reading I was planning on doing, and you could tell me how you feel about that. We could talk.
That would be a plus.
That would be a plus, yeah?
And if I was from Delhi or India, and I saw something in there that made me smile, like, oh yeah, that's how it was back when I was in India,
Yeah.
That would be cool too.
Yeah. Well, maybe I'll say yes because I want you to go buy the book. But definitely, you know. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, let me read a little bit, and you could tell me. And my story was actually very, perhaps I felt insecure about, you know, being an NRI writer. You know, many of you are familiar with the term. And, you know, being a writer of Indian origin who was born outside of India, and creating a book like this is kind of an awkward situation, inevitably. And being a non-born Indian, an Indian born outside of India, living in India, and there are now many of us in doing that. It's another interesting sociological phenomenon that will impact Indian literature in a major way, is awkward. And I kind of was really heavily grappling with the idea of that when I wrote this. So I think I almost defiantly tried to write what I saw as a very Indian story that only people in India would really get. But you could tell me what you think about it. This story, the thing I'll say from the beginning, it's the narrator is a woman. The narrator is not the protagonist. She's a character, but she's not the protagonist. There were two pieces that really influenced me while writing this piece. One of them was the film by Guru Dutt called Pyasa, as Abhishek and I were talking about a little while ago, and the other one was the novel by Pamuk, Snow. I don't know if any of you have read it, but there is this idea of this first-person narrator who's telling someone else's story and is somehow omniscient. Now, of course, Pamuk, I think he did a better job with the whole concept of that than I did, but maybe not. Let me start. It's called Gautam Under a Tree, and most of the stories I write, there's a main character with a Buddhist name, for whatever reason. And each story is set in a neighborhood, and this story is primarily set in Green Park, where I lived for a number of years. It was around 6 p.m. when he left his Barsati. Aurobindo Marg was more hellish than ever because of metro construction. At the Gurdwara, he began his walk through Yusuf Sarai. He remembered navigating the neighborhood's maze of back streets with Lori when she'd expressed interest in trying bhang. Bhang is drugs. A Barsati is a rooftop studio apartment, basically. The memory made him wince, I imagine. Most thoughts of her filled him with a mixture of anger and dread. Between Lahore jewelers and some sari shops, he noticed a new store dedicated exclusively to the sale of Korean plasma televisions. He'd always considered Yusuf Sarai a place where Delhi's real middle class came to shop, the family stacked on Vespas and stuffed into second-hand Maruti 800s. That seemed to be changing, he'd lament to me later. Crossing the road was a death-defying endeavor. According to his notes, a Blue Line bus and a Honda Accord almost ran him over. Then he spotted the beaming orange sign above the Boogie Down Restro Bar. No firearms permitted, unloaded or loaded, read a placard on the first floor of the hastily constructed structure. Standing beside it were some men in cheap black suits. Maitre d' bouncers, he called them. "May I help you?" the gang's tallest member asked in English. "I'd like a table," Gautam said in Hindi. "It's Saturday," replied the tall man in black. "No stags allowed on Saturday." Gautam's worn kurtis and scruffy face often elicited such reactions. Peering inside the bar, Gautam noticed that in addition to a couple of wives and an Eastern European prostitute, the place was teeming with men. West Delhi teenagers who didn't have the breeding to hit up the 5 stars, middle managers from domestic corporate houses who bought their suits at Raymond, small-time bureaucrats who extracted enough chai pani to afford an Esteem or a Ford Icon. Had he been somebody else, somebody practical, at this point Gautam would have launched into his dog-eared American English and gotten a table, as well as some respect. But practicality wasn't one of his strong points. "And what about all them?" he asked, in Hindi, of course. "VIP customers." English. "Actually, I have a reservation." The maitre d' stared back at him. He'd probably never heard anybody use the word arakshan to denote a restaurant booking before. "Under G.S. Lakshman," Gautam continued. Within minutes, he was seated at a secluded table, sipping fresh lime soda. The bar was dark, but lamps he described as space-age cast in an unsavory shade of orange. Gautam pulled out his notebook and scribbled half a dozen pages about the walk he'd just taken. He mentioned the music that was playing, Hotel California, followed by a set of film songs. Lakshman showed up 30 minutes later looking as gaudy as ever in his silk burgundy kurta and white churidar. I can't hide the fact that I don't care for Lakshman, but we don't necessarily have to like our benefactors. As the well-fed editor sauntered towards Gautam's table, Waiters bowed, and men with hairy ears broke from their conversation to greet him. Lakshman was, after all, a minor celebrity in the Indian capital. The chief lieutenant at a weekly magazine we'll call Satya, Truth. He was the one who'd engineered the sting that helped bring down the B-Party government, a, quote, fascist hate-mongering government, as Gautam referred to it. Keep sitting, Lakshman said when he got to Gautam's table. It's great to meet you in person. I'm a big fan of your work. Well, it's almost been 2 years since I published anything, said Gautam, unyielding to Lakshman's flattery. So tell me, Lakshman said, when did you move to India? I was born here. But your accent, Lakshman mused, chuckling his chuckle of self-contentment. You couldn't have picked that up in a call center. This question and answer period was, of course, extraneous. Lakshman already knew, or so he believed, everything there was to know about the mustached young man sitting before him. When his mother died, Gautam went to the U.S. on a tourist visa and bought a fake social security number. He changed his name to Greg, worked at a Kmart, and became more American than the Americans. After enrolling in a picturesque university, he directed plays and acquired a girlfriend, a blonde from California. But this high life unraveled during Gautam Greg's senior year. State policemen caught him with enough pharmaceuticals to put down a herd of elephants, and he was indefinitely banned from the country. I spent a few years in upstate New York, was all he told Lakshman. He never told me about his American years either, nor did he write about them in his journals. My sister-in-law lives in Toronto, said Lakshman, but I prefer it here too. Best of both worlds. His South Delhi English got under Gautam's skin. A waiter came, and Lakshman ordered a Johnny Walker Red Label, some burra kebabs and mozzarella sticks. Despite Lakshman's insistence that he have something hard, Gautam stuck with lime soda. Are you still making movies, man? Lakshman asked. He was referring to a documentary Gautam had worked on with the BAFTA-winning American director Laurie Zeller. Gautam didn't like to speak about her, and Lakshman must have known this. Lakshmanji, Gautam said, I'm a teacher now. You told me you had something to say about Kame. That's the only reason I agreed to meet you. I was just getting to your friend. Lakshman paused for a gulp of whiskey. He was a true patriot, wasn't he? I'm no judge of patriotism, said Gautam, but yes, he did good work. Gautam's Hindi was erudite, but awkward, as usual. You know, his death was no accident. Gautam, Kame was murdered. You think that's news to me? It shouldn't be, but I do have some knowledge that might interest you. That would surprise me. Gautam, I know who killed him, said Lakshman. After making his bold declaration, Lakshman stopped speaking to suck a mutton bone clean. You're a Hindi poetry aficionado, he resumed. You've obviously heard of Sri Rang Kumar, na? Of course. Gautam was particularly fond of one of Kumar's poems, The Englishman is Like a Magpie. He'd even written a column about it. But I don't think you've come here to discuss poetry, said Gautam. Be patient. Lakshman paused again, this time to wash down the meat with some more whiskey. You must know about Kumar's son, he said, tongue-polishing gums and teeth. Gautam nodded. Who hadn't heard of Ashok Kumar, industrialist, defense contractor, playboy? Well, said Lakshman, it's the younger Kumar who's responsible for your friend's death. The Canadian Aluminum Corporation, explained Lakshman, had paid Kumar a huge quantity to ensure that Kame would stop getting in its way. We have evidence, tape conversations, witnesses, bank statements. This might be one of the biggest cases of political corruption since Gujarat. And? Asked Gautam. And we want you to write the story. Gautam silently twirled the ends of his mustache and then began shaking his head. The tribals have been displaced, he said, and my friend's already dead. I fail to see the point of such a story. The point? Echoed Lakshman. Then he launched into an oration on the importance of the Fourth Estate in today's climate. Things like, now more than ever, as neo-imperialistic capitalism mingles with our corrupt bureaucracy, it's essential that investigative journalism preserve democracy. Anyway, it's a political piece. And I was kind of inspired by John le Carré in writing this part of the story. So what happens in this piece, it's kind of funny, some of the elements that kind of drove me to write it. One of the elements, it's kind of in some ways a satirical take on the film Born into Brothels, which I did a lot of work on when I was in Calcutta once, investigating kind of what was going on with it. So anyway, Gautam agrees to take on this story. There's this guy Gautam. He's kind of a disaffected former journalist, kind of deep, pensive, all sorts of ideals, shattered ideals. the best kind of idealist, the disaffected idealist. And he takes on this assignment to kind of avenge his friend's death. And his friend was this activist who worked to stop, neo-imperialistic exploitation in the hinterland of India. And that friend was killed for his activism. And that happens all the time. These type of deaths, convenient deaths, do occur. Gotham agrees to take on the assignment. The person narrating the story ends up becoming his lover. They get very close, and slowly by the end of the summer, we realize that this lover, this woman who's narrating the story, is actually kind of an agent, basically. She betrays him. She's a femme fatale, and she's torn whether she should kind of love. She likes this like quirky, nice guy, and eventually, and Gotham eventually has a choice to make. He has to basically choose between going on with his story and avenging his friend's death, or dropping the story. And if he drops the story, it turns out that this man who he's investigating, Abhishek Kumar, is going to arrange a visa for him to go to the United States, where he has a child, where he has an illegitimate child, but a child. What a word of my father's generation that came into my mouth. Where he has a child, and the mother of that child is this filmmaker, Laurie. I'm going to cut to the end of the story. So he has this decision to make, and he makes the decision. He decides he's going to drop this piece. He's not going to do it. He wants to. He realizes that everything is kind of BS anyway. There's no true vengeance can be attained in a world defined by corruption and fraud and unethicalness. So he drops it. He thinks he's going to have. He thinks he's heading back to the States, and he lets down this man Lakshman, who assigned the story to him. Remember, Lakshman wants to take down this B party, the BJP. Lakshman wants to take down the BJP. So when he was alone
Does Gotham know that the woman at this point is an agent?
He doesn't. He never finds out. When he was alone that night, Gotham called Lakshman and told him the article was off. "It's going nowhere and I'm tired," he said. Then there was some back and forth, during which Lakshman tried to appeal to his sense of justice and democracy. But Gotham was firm in his resolve to abandon the project. I was volunteering at the school the next morning. Gotham works in a school. She ends up volunteering there also. When a student stormed through the courtyard and screamed at the principal, "Gotham, sir, is lying dead in the park! Gotham, sir, is lying dead in the park!" I ran there as fast as I could. A crowd, this is Deer Park in Delhi, a crowd was staring from a safe distance. Servants walking sweater-clad dogs, prickly old men holding sticks to beat away strays and poor people. I pushed through them and his body came into view. Damaged, but not dead, he was sprawled beside an earth-colored Lodi tomb he often loafed around. An enormous gulmohar tree hung over him. It wasn't Lakshman himself who'd sent the goons with the cricket bats to Gotham's flat before dawn. His Sea Party colleagues had taken care of that. The sight of his bloodied, maimed face sent a wave of anguish through me. 2 security guards, uniformed UP-walas, were attending to his body. A wiry one was dragging Gotham by his arm and his curly locks, and a paunchy one was using a rifle to prod him. The butt of the gun met my leg with a considerable amount of force, and I let out a howl that snapped them out of their sadistic fever. Once I had their attention, I shouted a series of reprimands in English, peppered with words like idiot. Had Gotham been more alert, it would have unnerved him to hear how naturally such bilious Angrezi spilt from my tongue. But in the nation's capital, the Queen's language is still a deadlier weapon than a Mauser. After eyeing me up and down, the head guard decided I wasn't a force to reckon with. "Didi," he said, she's kind of this agent, and she's a very worldly woman at this point in her life, but she's kind of undercover and trying to be this very humble Hindi-speaking woman that would appeal to Gotham's sensibilities. "Didi," he said, his gaze now inflected with leering. My dress code for this assignment had meant my demotion from madam to sister. We're going to take him to the Thana, to the police station. Just listen to me, and you'll remain unharmed." When I dropped the name of some fictitious high-level official, my Mamaji, the High Court Justice, the guards became uneasy. But what really got them was the sight of the BlackBerry I pulled from my pocket. They couldn't have known what exactly it was or how much it cost, but even they knew it was far more expensive than the toys of the casually rich. I'd kept it concealed from Gotham all these weeks. The guards helped him up, and I walked out of Deer Park, supporting the weight of his semi-conscious 6-foot frame. After bringing him home, I stayed by his bedside for the next 20 hours. I only left when Ashok called me in for a meeting. I should have revealed to you guys so soon that she was bad. Kumar received me in his mahogany study. He was in a bathrobe and had a stoic look on his face. It was meant to communicate his disappointment in me. Things have gotten very complicated, was all he said. I didn't want it to come to this, but it's just best to finish this now, he said, and obviously destroy all his papers. Those were my orders, and they weren't unreasonable ones. I got up to leave, but Kumar motioned for me to stay. He picked up one of the 3 phones before him and said, "Bahadur, I'm not to be disturbed for 20 minutes. Then he got up and walked over to the expensive leather chair I was sitting on and untied his robe. There was nothing underneath it, just his hairy body, a gold chain, and the limp organ I was to make hard with my tongue. This was my medicine. I had to win my place back in his good books. I took the length of him into my mouth. No matter how far I moved away from Sonagachi, she used to be a prostitute, this man would never let me forget about the whore I once was. I returned to Green Park early the next morning, and as I climbed the stairs to the Barsati one final time, the dog began making noise, a series of shrill yelps, the sound of a puppy in distress. When I walked in, the thing pissed on the flats I was wearing, ethnic ones I would have gotten rid of anyway. Gotham's eyes were closed and his mustache was cake and vomit, but he was still breathing. On the floor was an empty strip of oxycodone, and next to it a brown envelope. Lakshman's people had sent it to him during my brief absence. I thumbed through its contents, 5 black and white photographs. In one of the pictures I was getting out of a car at the Kumar farmhouse. In another I was wearing a bikini on the beaches of Goa. But strangely, these pictures of me seemed in pristine condition, as if he'd barely glanced at them. Only one had been soiled by tears and fingerprints. It had clearly been too much for him. For me, the photo confirmed how tired I'd grown of this life I was supposed to be grateful for. The photo showed the mother of Gotham's child, Laurie. She was sitting on a bench having a conversation with my boss. I didn't know it then, but Ashok Kumar and Laurie Zeller had known each other. He'd paid her for knowledge of Kame's movement, and she'd used the money to help finish off her movie. I never confirmed that they'd been intimate, but I wouldn't be surprised. Staring at the photographs, I contemplated sparing Gotham. Images of us starting a new life together passed through my mind. That's what would have happened in a film. But I knew he'd be more useful, dead than alive. I took out a syringe from my bag and filled it with potassium chloride. Then I jabbed him between the toes. This was the only way I'd ever killed somebody. It was painless and civilized. With all the opiates and benzodiazepines in his system, the coroner would pronounce Gotham dead from an overdose. Nobody would lament the passing of this confused orphan. After shoving Gotham's notebook and computer into the jute bag he'd used for subsidies, I leashed the puppy and left the Barsati with it. When I contacted Lakshman, he was surprised to hear from me. It took some arranging, but eventually he was more than happy to print Gotham's expose on Kumar, which implicated my boss, the B Party, and the Canadian Aluminum Corporation in the murder of Kame Thakur. Months after the article was published, the C Party won key state elections and handed over Orissa's bauxite mines to more favorable industrialists. Bauxite is the mineral from which aluminum is derived. The party rewarded Lakshman for his services by securing him a position as an MD in an international media conglomerate. 3 weeks after Gotham's article came out, in London and in Delhi, a Criminal Bureau of Investigation probe was launched. My name came up during the investigation, but I'd long since made it abroad with my Indian pie dog. Ashok Kumar was arrested and caged in Tihar for a few months, where he was allowed to bathe in milk on Sundays. He was, of course, freed. In the days immediately after the article's publication, newspapers printed gushing obituaries about its author, referring to Gotham as one of India's finest young minds. Delhi's intelligentsia lamented his tragic death over kebabs and mojitos for a few months. Then they forgot he'd ever existed. So that's the piece, I think. And, for me, I wanted to write a deliberately noir piece of fiction. I felt like it was kind of my responsibility. I don't do this. I do think writing noir would be great, and I would want to write noir novels at some point in my life. But as an editor of the book, people were having a difficult time kind of taking on the genre, and they were kind of writing these kind of noirish stories that weren't exactly fitting the bill. So it was kind of my responsibility as the editor to delve right in and get my hands dirty and write something that would appeal to our intended audience of noir readers, of people who really dig this type of fiction. And that's it. That's all I have to say.